The Aegis. This combat system uses computers and radar to track and guide weapons to destroy enemy targets. A vertical launch system can fire a multitude of missiles against surface craft, anti-ship missiles, aircraft, submarines, land targets, and ballistic missiles. It can even engage all of these simultaneously.
The Civil War involved bloody battles and great technological change. Within days of the outbreak of war, the Union forces of the North established a blockade of Confederate ports, known as the Anaconda Plan. It aimed to cripple trade in cotton and munitions. In response, the South devised an ingenious strategy. A group of Southern businessmen and engineers, led by 40-year-old H.L. Hunley, experimented with submarines in Alabama. Their greatest success was a 30-foot vessel named the Fishboat. Attempts to use electric batteries and steam power had failed. They now relied on something more old-fashioned. The Fishboat was operated by 8 men turning a propeller shaft. It had 2 ballast tanks, one at either end, and along the keel, a weight that could be detached for emergency buoyancy. News of the submarine made its way to Charleston, South Carolina, the Confederate Army's biggest port. The South wanted to attach an explosive to the Fishboat and blow up the Union's ships.
During 1863, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard was in command of the defenses of Charleston, and he wanted to do everything he could to try and break through the blockading fleet.
During trials, the Fishboat sank twice, and a total of 13 crew members drowned. Undeterred, a new volunteer crew was found, and a plan devised to sink the USS Housatonic, anchored off Charleston. It was a key vessel in the North's blockade of the harbor.
The Housatonic was quite a significant American surface ship. And after initial failures, they managed to get the Hunley into position. It sort of paddled its way forward with the men inside working very hard. These early boats were armed with spar torpedoes, that is, a spar pointing from the front with an explosive on the end. The trouble with that was it was virtually an early version of suicide bombing.
We call them torpedoes, but really they're mines at the long of a long pole. They have a barbed end, so when the ship rams the hull, the barb will keep it in there as the Hunley then has to back out.
During the raid, the Housatonic's lookouts spotted the Hunley and desperately tried to escape, but it was too late.
The spar torpedo contacted the Housatonic. It went off, caused a huge explosion.
She disappeared below the waves in only 3 minutes. The first ship to be sunk by a submarine. 5 of her crew drowned. The Housatonic sank, but so did the Hunley.
At one level, this was the first successful submarine attack. But at another level, it demonstrated that really you had to develop a better weapon for the submarine and also to produce a proper power system as well.
During the Second World War, the Japanese Imperial Navy suffered greatly at the hands of the United States Navy. But towards the end of the war, a new submarine took to the ocean, the Japanese I-400 class. With these vessels, they hoped to change the course of the conflict. Each sub carried 3 seaplanes in a massive hangar. The planes had the ability to bomb U.S. West Coast cities.
They were built as submersible aircraft carriers. The original plan seems to have been to attack targets on the west coast of the United States, possibly using biological weapons, but there was some debate in the Japanese high command about this, and they were considered to be dishonorable.
Fortunately for the Allies, the Japanese surrendered before the I-400s could be deployed. The U.S. Navy seized the gigantic subs and had started inspecting them when the Russians announced they too were sending teams of technicians to analyze the I-400s.
The Americans took them over and as quickly as they could sank them because they didn't want the Russians getting their hands on them. They didn't want the Russians to have a threat against the United States using similar ideas.
For 200 years, conflict had prompted advances in submarine technology. The threat of a Cold War between the West and the Soviet Union was no different. A new type of submarine was needed for a nuclear age. In late January 1898, one of America's newest battleships, the USS Maine, sailed into Havana Harbor as a show of support for Cuban revolutionaries. But on February 15th, the USS Maine suddenly blew up in Havana Harbor. 266 men were killed. It was claimed a Spanish mine was responsible, but in truth, the most likely cause was a fire in a coal bunker. The American press, however, demanded revenge. "Remember the Maine" became the battle cry.
This led to President McKinley declaring war on the Spanish Empire to liberate Cuba from the Spanish yoke, and also to give the Americans the opportunity to have a go at Spanish position in the Pacific.
The United States Asiatic Squadron was led by 60-year-old Admiral George Dewey. Dewey's fleet of 9 ships sailed for the Philippines. Waiting for them off the coast of the capital, Manila, was the elderly Spanish fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Don Patricio Montojo y Pasaran.
Spanish Admiral Montijo realized that his force of colonial cruisers, many of them built of wood, quite obsolete with short-range weapons, would be completely outclassed by the Americans. So he put them as close to the shore as possible so that when they sank, the crew might have a chance of getting ashore.
On the early morning of May 1st, 1898, the Olympia led Dewey's fleet into Manila Bay with her 4 8-inch guns mounted on turrets, 10 5-inch guns for broadsides, and 21 smaller 15-caliber guns. The flagship was an impressive sight. And unlike his predecessors, Dewey didn't have to worry about the wind. Steam power offered him a variety of tactics.
As he comes into Manila Bay, Dewey has a choice. He can either anchor up opposite the Spanish fleet and just exchange fire with them until he wins, or he can reduce the risk to his own ships by keeping underway and making his ships a more difficult target for the Spanish gunners. Fire! His ships open fire and then circle round and open fire again. They just bombard the Spanish.
Manila Bay has been described simply as a gun duel.
Manila Bay is one of the last battles of the 19th century. There are no submarines, there are no airplanes, there are no soldiers. It really is just a fight between 2 fleets.
After a battle lasting 6 hours, with many of his ships sinking but still firing, Admiral Montojo surrendered.
The Spanish fleet had been shot to pieces, half it had sunk, and the rest of it was of not much further use.
330 men died on the Reina Cristina, and 90 were wounded. The wooden Castilla caught fire and sank with a loss of 25 men. The Olympia, however, sailed for Manila, with the ship's band playing Spanish tunes for the locals who'd come to stare at the victorious fleet. At 6:25 a.m. on D-Day, vessels emerged from the water that were unlike anything ever used in the history of warfare. These were duplex drives, tanks that swam.
The idea was that you would have tanks coming up the beach along with the very first wave of infantry, which meant, of course, that the tanks themselves had to be amphibious.
It took considerable ingenuity to come up with a tank that could make its own way ashore. An inventor named Nicholas Strausler believed he had the answer. His company built both collapsible boats and armored vehicles. Strausler built a prototype by adapting a Valentine tank, the workhorse of the British North Africa campaign. His creation was given the name Duplex Drive, DD for short, because it could be powered by the dual methods of propellers or tracks. By June 1944, most duplex drives were now modified American Sherman tanks. The Normandy invasion would see them used in battle for the first time. The night before D-Day, tank landing ships, or LSTs, carried 290 DDs across the Channel and close to the Normandy coast. At 5:50 the following morning, the first 29 DD tanks were launched by the Americans off Omaha Beach. Waves off Omaha reached 6 feet in height. 27 of those first 29 tanks sank like stones.
The problem was the weather was such that they could not function. They were fine in the tests in still water, but this was not still water, and most of them went straight to the bottom with their crews inside and never made it to shore.
On the British and Canadian beaches, there was greater success.
The British brought them much closer inshore, and they lost ones and twos, and they were successful in the sense that the troops had heavy support with their initial contact with the Germans.
On the beach, I gave orders to deflate the canvas skirt, and what happened next will always remain vivid in my memory. The German machine gunners in the dunes were absolutely stupefied to see a tank emerging from the sea. Some of them ran away, some just stood and stared, unable to believe their eyes. We mowed them down like they were corn on the cobs.
Out in the Channel in the early hours of D-Day was a tiny flotilla of vessels. Some of the unsung heroes of Operation Neptune. These were the Harbor Defense Motor Launches, or HDMLs, built to guard British ports against the threat of German submarines. Today, one HDML is preserved and still seaworthy, HMS Medusa. Medusa was designed to evade submarines using 2 engines that could be independently operated for extra turning power. The HDMLs had one unique attribute that was foremost in the minds of the D-Day planners. The boats were made of wood, undetectable by radar. To make up for the lack of armor plating, HDMLs like Medusa boasted some serious firepower.
The main armament on this vessel is 20mm Oerlikon. A good team on there can shift 400 rounds of high explosive shells in a minute. On the bridge wing behind me, there's 2 light caliber machine guns on each side. And these vessels were expected to get up close and personal with the opposition as well. On the bridge, there's 2 buckets of hand grenades. So you went up to the other chap and chucked one through the window.
The men who took their chances on a vessel designed for such close quarters fighting were nicknamed Churchill's Pirates. Churchill's Pirates would have a special task on D-Day. A German minefield stretched almost the entire length of the Channel. The invasion fleet could only pass through this seemingly impenetrable barrier once designated routes had been cleared by a fleet of minesweepers. Medusa and other HDMLs would station themselves at the entrances to these vital channels so that the landing craft and larger ships would see the safe route in. In the early 1800s, the United States was under pressure to put a stop to the vast numbers of African slaves entering the country. Following the lead of Great Britain, the U.S. agreed to abolish the lucrative trade.
The Americans outlaw the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. And in 1820, it's declared an act of piracy, punishable by death. So by the 1820s, it's illegal for American sailors to engage in the trade as well.
While 4 million slaves remained captive on United States soil, the U.S. Navy was given the job of ensuring that number didn't grow. A small fleet, known as the Africa Squadron, was formed to hunt down slave ships leaving Africa and bound for Cuba and South America.
When you have a profit margin of 1,000%, even if it's illegal, people are going to do it.
In September 1860, the Constellation was patrolling close to the Congo River Delta. For weeks, there had been no sign of slave ships. Then, on the afternoon of the 25th, one of Constellation's lookouts spotted a sail on the horizon.
She's in a suspicious area where we know there's some trouble going on. Constellation is a very fast ship. We fire a warning shot that says, "Stop your ship," and the ship doesn't stop.
The Constellation gains on the fleeing vessel. As it does, it becomes clear what cargo the ship is carrying.
She starts by throwing over jetsam and flotsam into the water, trying to lighten the ship to make it go a little faster. Then they employ a tactic where they start to unload some of their more important cargo, the human cargo. The hope is that the Constellation, given that its mission is to save those people, will stop to rescue people out of the water.
Faced with a horrendous decision, the Constellation pursues the slave ship. It fires shots through its rigging to force a surrender. The ship is identified as an American vessel named the Cora. The captain and crew of the Cora were arrested, transferred to the Constellation, and taken back to the United States to be tried. No longer destined for a life of slavery, 705 Africans were taken to the U.S. Protectorate of Liberia and were set free. By April 1975, the situation in Vietnam was very different. American troops had now withdrawn, and the North Vietnamese were poised to take the South's capital, Saigon. U.S. carriers were now involved in a last-minute evacuation of American civilians and South Vietnamese. On April 29th, Midway's crew spotted a small civilian aircraft approaching. They watched as the plane circled and noticed a small package being thrown onto the carrier's flight deck. It was a pistol wrapped in a note. It read, "Can you move the helicopters to the other side? I can land on your runway. I can fly for 1 hour more. Please rescue me. Major Buang, wife, and 5 child." Major Buang Lee was a South Vietnamese Air Force officer. The only way Major Buang can land is if the U.S. Navy helicopters on the overcrowded deck are moved out of the way. The Midway's captain didn't hesitate. He ordered several of his helicopters to be pushed off the flight deck and into the sea.
About $10 million worth of American air capacity pushed off the deck to save this one man and his family.
But with the flight deck now cleared, Major Buang still had a problem. His light aircraft was not designed to land on a carrier. It had no tailhook to catch the arresting wire. Plus, there was a strong crosswind. The American onlookers held their breath and watched the Major make a perilous landing. The men of the Midway were so impressed by Major Buang's bravery, they started a fund to help him and his family start a new life in the United States. January 21st, 1954, the USS Nautilus is launched. It's a key moment in the Cold War. Nautilus is the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Patrolling the world's oceans at 23 knots, she is fast. And unlike diesel submarines, Nautilus can stay submerged for weeks at a time. For the next 5 years, the United States dominates the seas. Finally, the Soviets respond. Their nuclear sub is called K-19, but it earns the nickname the Widowmaker.
Several people had died in its construction. We now know the construction had been too hasty. Too many things had been rushed in the attempt to catch up with the Americans and the technology that they were using to get this submarine out to sea.
In July 1961, K-19 was off the coast of Greenland on an exercise designed to show that Soviet nuclear technology now matched the Americans. It was a false claim with dire consequences. A pipe ruptured in K-19's nuclear reactor.
The reactor overheats and the cooling system fails. There is no backup.
K-19's captain, Nikolai Zetayev, was faced with the terrifying prospect of a nuclear explosion. But he and his crew kept their heads. A group of courageous engineers entered the compartment just above the reactor to try and repair the damage.
They're only wearing raincoats and gas masks. They have no other defense against the radiation, and they construct this alternative cooling system.
Amazingly, their hastily made device works.
and the temperature slowly comes down.
With the threat of a nuclear explosion now over, K-19 limped home. Captain Nikolai Zatayev was proclaimed a hero, but at a cost. 7 of the engineering team died of radiation exposure within 2 months. 15 more crew members died within 2 years. In 1935, an old wooden boat was recovered from a lake in upstate New York. Her cannons were still intact. It was soon confirmed that this was the oldest American combat ship ever found, the gunboat Philadelphia. The Philadelphia fought and sank during the War of Independence. The Philadelphia's mission was to defend the Champlain Valley, the American colony's northern frontier. The Continental Army feared the British would try to launch an attack from Canada.
There were very few frontier roads in those days, so using the water was the main way, not only to move troops, but to move in particular their supplies. So whoever had command of the lake in that campaign was going to be dominant, and both sides knew this.
The job of defending Lake Champlain fell to American General Benedict Arnold, but he had little time and few resources.
The men who made up the crews for these were not sailors. These were volunteers, these were soldiers, militiamen. Maybe a few of them had sailed a boat before, most had not. This was very much an amateur hour for the American fleet.
On the morning of October 11th, 1776, 30 British vessels swept down from the north. Waiting for them by Valcour Island was Arnold's fleet of just 15 vessels. Arnold's small fleet fought bravely all day, but they were outgunned. As dusk approached, the Philadelphia was hit squarely by a 24-pound shot. She sank so quickly that when she was recovered 160 years later, one cannon still had iron shot in its muzzle, ready to fire. Soundly defeated, the 5 remaining American boats fled.
The British chased them up the lake, sinking several, and those that were not sunk were run aground and set afire.
But the Americans had bought themselves valuable time. The British returned north to wait out the winter in Canada. The Philadelphia's career had lasted all of 2 months, but her legacy endured much longer. On display at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, she's a tribute to those first makeshift gunboats and their scrappy crews. A long-retired warship is moored on England's River Medway in Kent. Her unique paint job and her hull shape tell a story of wartime lies and deceit on a massive scale. This is HMS President. In the First World War, the greatest menace to Allied shipping was the formidable and elusive German U-boat. Merchant vessels were an easy target. The British needed a plan.
The ships themselves were often done out in very proud British colours, but that gave anyone who wanted to attack them a very clear idea of exactly what ship it was. Once it became clear that that was helping U-boats, they had to think about other changes.
Desperate measures were needed, and in 1917, inspiration came not from the world of naval architecture, but from an unlikely source.
An idea came up which had been used by artists, young contemporary artists, Picasso for instance, who were breaking up the lines of paintings and portraits and still lifes in order to show people a different view of what that object looked like. And the concept came about, well, if you could do that with paintings, with bowls of fruit, you could do that with a ship so that it would confuse the U-boat captain as to which direction the ship was going, what speed was it going, and was there one ship or 2 ships or 3 ships? Because that was what was necessary for the U-boat captain in order to decide where to fire his torpedo.
The man behind this extraordinary idea was an artist named Norman Wilkinson. He worked out that you could never completely camouflage a ship because the funnels would always give it away. But you could confuse the enemy by turning your ship into a floating Picasso. The technique became known as dazzle painting. The technique was unproven and hugely time-consuming, but it was taken up on a massive scale. Merchant ships, warships, and troop ships were all painstakingly repainted in minute detail. Among the iconic World War II patrol boats in the Battleship Cove Museum in Massachusetts is an odd-looking wooden craft. When the museum acquired it in the 1970s, they believed it was a Japanese kamikaze boat built for suicide missions against Allied warships. Then, in 2011, classified CIA documents were released, revealing it to be nothing of the kind. The boat was not Japanese, but in fact, American. It was a semi-submersible, developed and built by the forerunner of the CIA, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS.
It was designed to run shallow in the water, just enough for the glass cupola and the stacks to be above the water. Only 2 of these vessels were built.
The men who developed this secret craft nicknamed it Gizmo. Gizmo was built for the Pacific War version of DDay, an amphibious invasion of Japan called Operation Olympic. X-Day, as it was known, would be November 1st, 1945. Supported by bombers, over 42 aircraft carriers and 400 destroyers would be involved. Intelligence on military bases near the invasion sites was essential. The Gizmos were tested at night, without permission, outside the Los Angeles Naval Base. If discovered, they would be treated as enemy vessels.
The idea was to sneak into the naval base undetected. Even the naval base was not aware that they were sneaking in to make the challenge more realistic.
The Gizmos succeeded every time. The Gizmo teams never made it beyond American waters. Unknown to any of them, a parallel strategy to end the war was being developed. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Japan surrendered 9 days later. The secret Gizmo project was canceled.
The Vikings came from Scandinavia, the 3 territories that we know today as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden.
Norway literally means the northern way, the northern sailing route, and it's one long coastline punctuated by fjords, while the land itself is broken up by mountains. So it's much easier to get around by boat than by land.
Forced into ships, they were quick to realize the possibilities.
I think they were very astute people, that they could see quite quickly, again, through this maritime network that they had, that there was a much wider world out there. And I think it's probably one of the most important aspects of the Viking Age, that they were very much a people who looked outwards. They are exceptionally curious people and exceptionally brave in terms of where they want to go with their ships and why.
The Vikings had dreams of exploration and conquest. They needed a vessel to match: the longship. Remarkably, some still survive. This is a so-called Osberg ship, uncovered from a burial mound south of Oslo in Norway in 1904. It's now in the capital's Viking Ship Museum. It is the oldest Norwegian Viking ship. 95% of its original timbers survive.
This Viking ship was preserved like a tinned Viking ship, really. No one had seen anything like it. It was even so well preserved that one day the archaeologist found a bucket, like a huge bucket, and in the bucket there were apples, and they were still red. That's amazing.
The features that made it such an effective combat ship are also intact. Most important is its shape. The longship, a catch-all term for all large Viking vessels, has a shallow draft, meaning that very little of the hull was below the waterline. This helped them move swiftly and in shallow water, deep into enemy territory.
In the beginning of the Viking era, it's really the speed at which they were able to attack, that their ships just gave them a mobility that was unheard of, essentially, that they can just round a headland in a fleet of ships and sail right up onto the beach.
They can also go right up rivers and sail deep inland. That meant that they could attack targets inland in Britain and Ireland. In France, they sailed all the way up to Paris, up the Seine. In Russia, again, they're penetrating deep into the river systems.
Soon they ventured even further, to the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and west across the North Atlantic. Their raiding ships had to withstand longer voyages and combat at sea. From the 8th century, they were equipped with a large sail, which was supported by a massive block of timber called a keelson. It spread the weight of the mast and the strain of the sail when underway. When there was no wind, the crew would place oars through holes in the upper strakes, or planks. Parts of the decking were kept loose, so weapons and plunder could be stored underneath. And it was designed to strike terror upon arrival.
I think it probably would have been an incredibly awe-inspiring and terrifying sight that we know from the historical depictions that these ships were highly decorated, quite a few of them would have been painted, and I think it probably would have just struck absolute terror into the hearts of people if you knew that when you saw a fleet of 5, 10, 15 ships coming around the headland and you knew that they were full of warriors and that they were sailing directly for your little coastal settlement. I think you would pack your bags and head for the hills as quickly as you could.
The Viking ships helped make them the dominant force in Europe for over 200 years. Their shallow draft shape was perfect for storming beaches. Their construction made them strong and versatile assault vessels. The Osberg and Gokstad ships, now in a museum in Oslo, like all Viking longships, were clinker-built. That means constructed using overlapping planks or strakes. It was a highly successful technique. The Vikings laid the keel first. It was often made of a single piece of wood. They built up overlapping planks on either side of the keel, then secured them with iron nails. The shipwrights fastened floor timbers across the lower planks to support the shape of the hull. They then placed the keelson, which holds the mast in position. Cross beams known as bights lock the sides together. The Vikings cut oar holes into the upper planks. The mast and deck were fitted. They then added a steering oar to the right-hand side of the stern. The word starboard derives from this steering board. In a workshop in the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde in Denmark, a team of shipwrights still make clinker-built ships using traditional tools and techniques. They use the wood favored by their Viking ancestors, oak.
It has the quality that it's strong, but it's also durable against rot, so it lasts for a long time. It has acid in it, which is resistant towards fungus and rot. So it's both strong and durable.
The Vikings didn't use saws for boat building. They cleaved, that is, split the trunks to keep the natural strength of the wood. It's possible to obtain 25 planks from this single 200-year-old tree.
You start out with small wedges, and then you slowly change into bigger wedges. You can see that the moist of the wood is actually coming out, so there's already quite a lot of pressure on. This tree is 200 years plus 210 years approximately. And it's really wide pieces of planking we get out here. It's nearly 1.5 feet, something like that. So it's a really big piece of oak. The plan with this oak is to split it into quarters, eighths, and 16ths. So in the end, you come out with approximately this much piece of material, and then you start chopping it down with your axe from there.
Then, as now, the Vikings knew their way around an axe.
So I'm just shaping off, so it's the fine-tuning.
The Viking shipbuilders wasted nothing.
They would use really every part of the tree where the branches were bending. They would use exactly those bends where they needed this ship in the ship.
This is the American PT658, one of only 2 operational World War II PT boats left in the world. PT stands for Patrol Torpedo. Nicknamed mosquito boats, they were small but fierce.
PT boats were unique in that they were the most heavily armed ship for their size in the Navy.
The U.S. Navy tested the first prototypes in 1939, just in time for the brand new PTs to receive a baptism of fire. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. entered the Second World War. Japanese forces quickly spread across the Pacific Islands. The stunned American Navy had few options. PT boats were cheap, flexible, and available. The versatile vessel quickly became a jack of all trades.
In all sorts of other roles, of reconnaissance, rescuing pilots, they were absolutely invaluable because they were very fast, very light, small crews.
Qualities that would prove pivotal in one of the war's most famous missions. In March 1942, the Japanese were on the verge of invading the US-held Philippines. There, General MacArthur was holding out on Corregidor Island. Commander of US Army forces in the Far East and America's most famous military leader, MacArthur was too important to be captured. President Roosevelt ordered him to escape to Australia. PT boats were given the task to get him to safety. On the night of the 11th of March 1942, 4 PTs carrying MacArthur, his family, and staff set off from Corregidor. To escape, they would have to slip through a Japanese naval blockade in the dark. MacArthur recalled the tense moment they approached the enemy ships.
We waited, hardly breathing, for the first burst of shell that would summon us to identify ourselves. 10 seconds, 20, a full minute. No gun spoke. The PTs rode so low in the choppy seas that they had not spotted us.
600 grueling miles and 36 hours later, MacArthur's PT boat reached Mindanao Island, where the U.S. still controlled an airfield. From here, a B-17 bomber took him to Australia. There, MacArthur made a famous vow.
I said to the people of the Philippines whence I came, I shall return. Tonight, I repeat those words. I shall return.
In March 1945, MacArthur did just that, driving the Japanese out of the Philippines. He decided to return to Corregidor Island on a PT boat.
We had departed in the darkness of a somber night. We came back in the sunlight of a new day.
In the 21st century, military superpowers find themselves facing small, unpredictable foes. Stealth combat ships have evolved to fight this asymmetric threat.
In 2000, the U.S. Cole was hit by terrorists, and 17 American sailors died in that attack in Yemen. After that attack, I started thinking about why the Navy doesn't have a high-speed protection boat, a gunship, to be able to protect their assets when they're in foreign countries. I quickly realized that it was a complex problem, and I started studying different boat designs.
After 4 years of research, 3 years of construction, and $22 million, Greg named the finished ship Ghost. Ghost is designed for a multitude of roles. For fleet force protection or anti-piracy operations, it can carry cannons or guided missiles like the Griffin or Spike to take out sea and land-based targets. Carries special sensors for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Or act as an assault vessel with room for 18 Navy SEALs. But versatility wouldn't mean much unless Greg could find a way to keep the boat steady in rough waters.
One of the biggest problems with patrol boats today is trying to fire any weapon systems off them. They're so unstable. You're moving so much, it's so hard to target.
His solution was an unusual-looking design shipbuilders call swath.
A swath rides below the water, so wave impacts don't matter to us that much because a wave impact can only hit the front of what we call our struts, which are very sharp, which cleanly cut the waves without putting a lot of force against the hull itself.
The result is a much smoother ride. But the design poses another issue: drag. The resisting force of water against the hulls, which could impact Ghost's speed.
And I knew right away that I had to find a way to reduce the hull friction. And that led me to putting the propellers on the front of the design of the vessel. We're basically pulling the vessel through the water, not pushing it. And if you were pushing a vessel like this through the water, you could create structural problems with the vessel.
These frontal propellers also unlocked a revolutionary idea, one that would make Ghost the fastest swath ship on the ocean. The key is a phenomenon called cavitation.
Cavitation itself is simply changing water, like boiling it, except that you're just changing the pressure, not the temperature.
Fast-moving propellers create areas of lower pressure on their blades, causing the water to boil at ambient temperature. This creates a trail of vapor bubbles or foam.
What we're doing is we're creating underwater foam tunnels with the front of the propellers. So we're flying through foam that's less dense than water, which gives us much better efficiency.
Ghost has a top speed of 45 miles per hour, a world record for swaths.
I am invigorated by science completely. I love it. I love doing stuff that other people haven't done before.
Fast, stable, and stealthy, Ghost is a truly innovative combat ship. Named after the royal family, the Vasa was built in 1626, a time when Sweden was becoming a military force. The Swedish king, Gustav Adolf, had ambitious plans for his nation. Gustav wanted to create a new type of navy. Instead of using ships simply to carry soldiers, he wanted them to be heavily armed gun platforms. In the winter of 1626, the Vasa took shape in the royal dockyard in Stockholm. King Gustav had already reformed his army, making sure his soldiers all had the same type of musket. He wanted every ship in his navy to have the same type of powerful bronze cannon. The Vasa's 64 guns could fire over 500 pounds of shot in a single broadside, traveling almost at the speed of sound. That many 24-pounder guns needed an extra deck, so the shipwrights made the ship taller. That created a problem.
It's going to be higher out of the water, more windage, more weight high up, but nothing extra below the waterline, no extra ballast, no extra stability. This ship is going to be dangerously top-heavy. Anybody who knew anything about ships would have known that this was not a good idea. But the king is absolute and the king's will prevails.
On the Sunday afternoon of the 10th of August, 1628, Vasa was finally ready to set sail. The king was away at war in Prussia, but thousands of his subjects turned out to watch. The Vasa sailed about 1,000 yards, and then the breeze picked up.
And when the first gust of wind filled the sails, the ship began to heel to the port side, this side behind me, and it hung there for a minute. It didn't really come back up the way a ship should. Knowledgeable people on board must have realized already that there was something wrong. Everybody else and guests probably just held their breath for a minute or laughed it off.
But things escalated quickly.
The wind filled the sails again, and the ship heeled even more over to port. In fact, it heeled so far to port that The lower row of gun ports went into the water.
The sea began to pour in on one side of the deck, pushing the port side down even further, so even more water ran in, cascading down into the hull. From that moment, the Vasa was lost.
The ship simply filled with water and sank like a stone. It was probably gone within 10 minutes.
For over 300 years, the mighty combat ship lay at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, until 1961, when Anders Franzén and his team brought her to the surface. He had great plans for the Vasa.
The brilliance of Franzén was he was a great salesman, and he had a vision of what Vasa could become. He saw that Vasa could become the centerpiece of a world-class museum.
The ship is now one of Sweden's most popular tourist attractions, a 400-year-old cautionary tale.
So we have the world's most unsuccessful 17th century warship on display as an example of what not to do in future.
Under the waters of this bay in western Japan are the remains of a combat fleet. Until D-Day, it was the largest armada in history. In the 13th century, the ruthless Mongol warlord Genghis Khan created one of the largest empires the world has ever seen.
The Mongol dynasty at that time stretched from East Asia to Europe. It ruled about 30% of the world's territories.
But Japan stood defiant. His grandson, Kublai Khan, wanted to change that. In 1281, he assembled a mighty fleet and sailed for Japan. The 13th century explorer Marco Polo wrote,
Kublai, the Grand Khan, having heard much of the immense wealth that was in this island, formed a plan to get possession of it. For this purpose, he sent 2 of his barons with a great navy and a great force of horse and foot.
Most of the fleet anchored here, Imari Bay, off Kyushu. Thousands of Kublai Khan's troops made their way ashore. Japanese samurai defenders fought back hard.
The Japanese actually knew that the Chinese were coming, so they were probably prepared to fight against this larger fleet that was coming from China.
But the Japanese were outnumbered. Defeat seemed inevitable. Then their emperor prayed for divine intervention. According to legend, a miracle happened. The weather suddenly changed.
The winds were probably much higher than usual, maybe tens of meters per second. So strong, in fact, that people wouldn't have been able to stand. In Imari Bay, where the waves would usually be calm, many of Khan's ships sank.
Some vessels tried to escape into deep water, some tried to set anchor to brace against the wind. So it was probably just a panic everywhere.
It's believed over 100,000 men drowned. Kublai Khan's remaining forces were soon overwhelmed. He called off the attack. Japan was saved, and the story became legend.
Gannet represents the type of small cruiser which was vital for the policing of the British Empire. Their main role was cruising around the seas of the world, protecting trade and interdicting the enemy's trade.
A small gun and a British flag are usually enough to get regional players to behave themselves. The Royal Navy is too important to mess around with.
As cruisers like Gannet policed the oceans for Britain, they found themselves on the front line in the fight against the slave trade. Britain had once traded slaves heavily, but outlawed it in 1807 after intense public pressure.
You have the establishment of the West Africa Squadron,
which consists of a number of Royal Naval vessels which are tasked with patrolling the west coast of Africa and intercepting slaving vessels of other countries, as well as the odd British interloper.
The anti-slavery patrol was one of the most fraught, difficult tasks the Royal Navy had to face. On the West African coast, they had to patrol 3,000 miles of very impenetrable coastline where slavers were making huge fortunes.
While unable to completely stop this well-funded, gruesome industry, the Royal Navy did have some success.
The most obvious positive outcome from the activities of the West Africa Squadron is the saving of 150,000 African lives, which otherwise would have been obliged to survive the journey across the Atlantic and into enforced servitude.
The brutal Atlantic slave trade only stopped when slavery was abolished in the Americas in the 1860s. But the trading of humans in Africa was not yet over.
Britain's anti-slavery efforts do shift from the Atlantic world into the Indian Ocean. Along the east coast of Africa, particularly in Zanzibar and in Mombasa, you had a number of sultanates which, as a central point of their economy, were supplying huge numbers of enslaved Africans to markets in Egypt, in Sudan, in Oman, and elsewhere in what we now describe as the Middle East.
HMS Gannet was sent to stop it. She made regular anti-slavery patrols in the Red Sea. In 1887, Gannet's crew spotted a suspicious ship.
They stopped an Arab dhow, which was a small Arab trading ship. And in that particular case, the Arab dhow indicated that it probably was doing something that they didn't like by opening fire on the crew.
A journalist based in Suakin reported on the incident.
While chasing a supposed slave dhow near Mersa Halib, the boat's crew was suddenly attacked by a large party of natives concealed in a creek. Lieutenant Stewart was fatally wounded and died on board.
The slavers likely sunk their own ship and fled. Undeterred, HMS Gannet continued her patrols until the slave trade ended around 1900. She survives as a powerful symbol of the Victorian anti-slavery campaign. In 2009, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown gave President Obama a gift of a pen holder made from a piece of timber from the Gannet. The old cruiser's battles are not forgotten. In the mid-1950s, missiles began replacing guns as the main armament on combat ships. Today, this development has allowed the fusion of multiple roles into fewer, more versatile vessel types, like the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. There are 67 of these ships in service today, with more planned. One of those 67 is USS Howard.
As a class of ship, it's a guided missile destroyer where we provide air warfare, surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, strike warfare, and able to provide those across the globe.
Its diverse capabilities have made it a jack of all trades. Its incredible effectiveness is down to an advanced system, the Aegis. This combat system uses computers and radar to track and guide weapons to destroy enemy targets. A vertical launch system can fire a multitude of missiles against surface craft, anti-ship missiles, aircraft, submarines, land targets, and ballistic missiles. It can even engage all of these simultaneously. Aegis is designed to help the crew in the CIC assess the threat and determine which weapon can best deal with it. Once the target is verified and the correct countermeasure is chosen, there is a final control before launch.
So FCA-3 Duncan is the missile system supervisor. So he is the last line of defense before we actually launch missiles. He is maintaining the overall inventory and control of those missiles before they leave the vertical launching system. So key player in combat.
As well as missiles, USS Howard has a pair of rotating cannons, known as CIWS, to defend the ship. These can fire 20mm shells at a rate of 4,500 rounds a minute.
Close-in weapon system is a weapon system that's more of a short range, last line of defense. It's computer controlled, radar guided to deliver rounds downrange. Its primary mission is to engage anti-ship missiles. Secondary mission area would be surface contacts. So prior to any pre-fire checks that we do, we make sure that all the tension is set properly, that all of these brackets are properly secured. Make sure our hero shield is installed. Ammunition feed belts clipped in properly to the entrance and exit units. And the clips are properly mated on the transfer unit. So once we verify that all the lock wire and the pins and the brackets are properly installed, then that's pretty much pre-fire checks done.
When CIWS verifies an incoming missile threat, it tracks the threat till it's in ideal range and opens fire.
It's a fully autonomous weapon system, completely self-reliant and absolutely lethal. It will shoot until there are no rounds left. Even if the ship is sinking, this gun will defend the ship.
USS Howard is packed with impressive hardware and software, but drills and training are essential to ensure everyone on board knows what to do in combat.